everyone. So I'm just going to start off by defining nanotechnology, and then I'll go into some of the dangers associated with nanotechnology and problems with regulating it. And I'll also discuss some of the existing regulatory policies that are in place, and I'll end things by proposing a new regulatory framework. So firstly, what exactly is nanotechnology? Well, it's pretty difficult to define because there are so many applications for nanotechnology. And even now, nanotechnology is being employed in drugs, medical devices, food, in additives, and even in electronics. And as technology advances, this is going to become even more sophisticated. So the potential applications of nanotechnology could be extremely widespread. Just as an example of future applications, we can even have invisibility cloaks. So there are researchers at the University of Pennsylvania who are working on creating a cloak with nanomaterials that can bend light away from an object, and this would make it invisible to the human eye. And just last month, Google announced that they're going to be working on a cancer detector. So they would ask patients to swallow a pill, and then this pill would have nanoparticles in it that would be absorbed into your bloodstream, and it would go and find your cancer cells. And theoretically, these nanoparticles are going to transmit information to a wristband sensor. So because we have all of these potential applications for nanotechnology, it makes it really hard to find one encompassing definition for it. But Pelley and Sanner define it as, quote, the particles, materials, and products at the nanoscale, as well as the technologies, such as high-powered microscopes that are used to manipulate, visualize, and characterize materials on this scale. But this definition is a bit vague in terms of what nanoparticles are and even what scale they're talking about. So the European Commission defined nanoparticles as, quote, the insoluble or biopersistent and intentionally manufactured materials with one or more external dimensions or an internal structure on the scale from 1 to 100 nanometers. So this definition stresses that nanoparticles are synthetic, and this would seemingly exclude all of the natural configurations. So another interesting characteristic about nanoparticles is that they have a huge surface area relative to their volume. So on this graph here, on the x-axis we've got diameter, and on the y-axis we have the surface area. And we can see that as the diameter decreases, the surface area of the nanoparticle increases exponentially. So with a larger surface area, you can have increased reactivity of the nanoparticle, and this has very important implications for some of the dangers associated with nanotechnology. So nanotechnology can pose huge health risks. Presently, there have been research done in animal models that have shown nanoparticles can induce toxicity. And their nanotechnology can also pose a risk to the environment. So we're not too sure yet about how nanoparticles will interact with the environment. So if there's improper disposal of nanoparticles, then there could potentially be nanopollution. So just to illustrate some of the potential risks associated with nanotechnology, I'm going to use the example of carbon nanotubes. So carbon nanotubes are essentially different arrangements of carbon, and they can be arranged in different ways, so armchair, either zigzag or chiral. Carbon nanotubes have very useful properties. They're lightweight, they're tensile, and they also conduct electricity very well. And because of these useful properties, carbon nanotubes are being heavily researched for use in electronics, such as batteries and fuel cells, drug delivery, so it could potentially help cross the blood-brain barrier, and even in textiles. However, there is also a darker side to carbon nanotubes. So there are studies in rats that have shown that carbon nanotubes can have carcinogenic effects, and in mice, carbon nanotubes have also been shown to suppress the immune system. So this is very problematic, but we also don't know how these animal model findings will translate into humans, but there is a risk of adverse health effects in humans. So nanotechnology can also pose some serious environmental hazards. So we don't know how a lot of nanoparticles degrade, and we don't know if they're going to just persist in the environment for ages and ages. And it's also very difficult to predict their interactions with the environment right now. And I've got a figure here that shows all of the different ways that nanoparticles can enter our ecosystem. So firstly, you can have spillage into the soil or into the water. And from the water, nanoparticles could potentially leach into the aquifer. Nanoparticles could also end up in the air as dust particles. And there are some serious implications for this because nanoparticles, they can enter our soil, and from there they can affect our plants, and as we go up the food chain, wildlife and humans could be impacted by nanoparticles. So back to the example of carbon nanotubes to demonstrate the environmental hazards. Carbon nanotubes have very low degradability, and it's been shown that they can accumulate. So this is very problematic, especially if carbon nanotubes get into the air as dust particles and we start inhaling them. So carbon nanotubes in mice have been shown to be toxic to the lungs, and it's even been likened to the 21st century asbestos. So there are some serious implications associated with carbon nanotubes for our health, and we still have to determine how to assess these risks. So there are a number of challenges with regulating nanotechnology. So in order to make the best policies that can balance risk and the potential benefits of nanotechnology, we need to do a lot of risk analysis. But risk analysis is going to hinge upon data collection, which I'll be showing you is very resource consuming. And another issue associated with data collection is that we lack a lot of gold standard toxicological assessments. And another major challenge associated with regulating nanotechnology is just categorizing what counts as nanotechnology and what doesn't count. So there's a lot of debate about which substances are considered new and thus has to be regulated as nanotechnology, and which ones are considered existing. And another question that arises is whether products that incorporate nanoparticles should be counting as nanotechnology. So I'll be exploring a bit more of these in detail. So firstly, with data collection, we do have to perform lots of research to assess the health risks associated with nanotechnology, and we have to understand a lot of the factors. So we need to know how nanoparticles are going to be transported through different body compartments. We need to know how they're going to be absorbed by different surfaces. And another important factor is understanding how the surface reactivity of the material can impact its catalysis of reactions within the human body. And another factor we need to understand is how the nanoparticle size is going to elicit different biological effects. When we want to evaluate the risks that nanotechnology poses to the environment, we have to characterize how these nanoparticles are going to interact with the environment. But this is made more difficult because nanoparticles are going to be transformed throughout their life cycle. So nanoparticles could have different structures and thus different properties when they're being synthesized for research, when it's being manufactured, when it's being distributed, used, and finally when it's being disposed. So we have to understand these properties in order to have the best environmental understanding. The problems associated with data collection is even further magnified by the fact that we have to assess all of the properties I've just talked about for all of the possible chemical and physical configurations of a nanoparticle. So just to illustrate how many configurations of nanoparticles there are, I have this figure here. So nanoparticles can be spheres, they can be rods, they can be cubes, micelles, vesicles, and even wires. So it's certainly a tall task when it comes to collecting data for risk analysis. And the other problem associated with data collection is that we don't have gold standard toxicological assessments. So right now, a lot of these toxicological tests fail to account for the differences between nanoparticles and their bulk counterparts when it comes to pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. And this is going to be a problem, especially if nanoparticles are going to be used as drugs. We need to understand the half-lives of these nanoparticles. We need to understand how they're going to interact with different cells, as well as their efficacy. And another problem associated with these toxicological assessments is that they only test for short-term effects. But we're more interested in the long-term effects of nanoparticles, especially as seen with the carbon nanotubes and the potential for lung toxicity. So another problem that arises from trying to regulate nanotechnology is determining what counts as nanotechnology and what doesn't count. So there's a debate about which particles count as new and which ones count as existing and old. So with elements like carbon and silver, we've known about them for centuries, but it's only been in the last few decades where we've known about nanoparticles, and we know that they have different properties because of their much smaller size and their increased surface reactivity. So with these different properties, does it mean that silver nanoparticles are new chemicals, or are they going to be considered existing? So that's one question that we still have to address. And another question that we have to answer is whether or not nanoparticles being incorporated into various products will make it nanotechnology. So as an example of this ambiguity, I have Gorilla Glass here. So Gorilla Glass is found on smartphones, laptops, and tablets. And in order to make Gorilla Glass, you have to infuse potassium ions onto the glass surface, and the potassium ions will reinforce and strengthen the glass. Now, it becomes a question of whether or not just having these potassium ions in place, does that make it nanotechnology? Personally, I don't think it does, because these potassium ions are found in nature. So with a lot of these problems, there are governments that are trying to come up with policies that can best address these problems. So from the policies that I've read about, they do have some common themes. So firstly, they agree that nanotechnology research should be furthered because it has a lot of potential for economic benefits, and it can bring about economic prosperity. They also agree that we need to exercise caution because we lack knowledge about the adverse side effects of nanotechnology, and we also don't have very good methodologies to evaluate the risks associated with nanotechnology. And finally, a lot of these policies also agree that we need to frequently assess regulations that are in place and update them as technology advances. So I'll just be going through 3 policies, 2 from the European Union and 1 from the United States. So for the European Union, I think they're starting to tighten up their nanotechnology regulations. And in 2009, they amended their novel food regulation so that any foods that have nanomaterials are now going to be prohibited. And this effectively imposed a moratorium on foods with nanoparticles until adequate safety testing methodologies become available. But there is one problem with this. We don't know when this moratorium is going to end because it's going to take a while in order to develop adequate safety assessments. And the EU has also implemented the draft report on the regulatory aspects of nanomaterials. So some of the highlights of this report, so the first one is that the products that contain nanomaterials have to be labeled. And this is a good way to start informing consumers about what's actually in their products. And another highlight is that the EU will start developing tests that assess the hazards of nanomaterials throughout their life cycles. And there is one problem that I can see with this. So when you're assessing, when you're developing tests, you also have to ensure that they're going to be able to assess the safety of products that are on the market now. And you also want to design them so that they can assess the safety of products in the future. Otherwise, there could just continue to be a lag, and we still wouldn't really know how safe nanoparticles and nanotechnology is in the future. So in the US, I find that they're a bit more relaxed in terms of their regulations. So nanotechnology in the US is controlled by the Toxic Control Substances Act, and manufacturers of new chemicals have to submit pre-manufacture notices to the Environmental Protection Agency 90 days before production begins. And during this time, the Environmental Protection Agency is going to review and evaluate the health and environmental risks associated with the chemical. And if they find that it's too dangerous, they can impose limitations on its manufacture or even ban it completely. However, I think it's very easy for manufacturers to be able to evade this policy, because really the onus is on the government to find all of these products that with nanoparticles on the marketplace, and it just becomes really tricky for the EPA because nanoparticles are hard to detect and they don't have the means to go through all of the products on the marketplace. So evasion, I think, is a problem here. So there are some benefits as well as weaknesses with some of the policies that I've just talked about, and for my proposed regulatory framework, I've tried to address some of these weaknesses. For me personally, I think it would be best to take a very cautious approach with nanotechnology because there are so many adverse side effects to human health and to the environment. It would be best, I think, to work on minimizing these risks. So for my regulatory framework, I would call for the creation of an international regulatory body. And this would be beneficial for a number of reasons. Firstly, just having one international regulatory body would eliminate confusion over conflicting regulations that could otherwise arise amongst different nations. And secondly, we could improve the compliance and increase the accountability of nations and manufacturers that aren't fully adhering to policies. So nations within the regulatory body could apply some pressure on the manufacturers and the nations who are a bit more lackluster. However, I do recognize that it is pretty idealistic to create an international regulatory body. First of all, it would be very difficult to attain universal membership. So there are always going to be diplomatic tensions between different nations, and there could even be a lack of political will to join in on such an organization. And there's also an obstacle that arises when we have to determine how much each nation contributes to the work of the international regulatory body. So if we do create an international regulatory body, then it would be important to build up the research infrastructure. So it would be very crucial that there are significant investments into basic and applied research, and by ensuring that we do have a lot of funding for this type of research, we could also help foster innovation, and this could bring about economic benefits in the future. And to also build up the research infrastructure, we could train more nanoscientists as well as increase the number of collaborations between different research groups across different universities, and also we could increase the collaborations between academia and the industry. So having set up this research infrastructure, then it would be important to focus on developing the safety assessments, and this would enable us to do a comprehensive risk analysis before we go about creating policies. So in order to develop these safety assessments, it would be very important that we allocate significant funds towards this field. And when these toxicological assessments are fully developed, then we would have to implement toxicology testing internationally. So to facilitate this, the international organization could subsidize the equipment and the costs associated with testing. And it will also be important that manufacturers submit information on their toxicological findings of their products. And I think it's very crucial that it's made mandatory for the manufacturers to do so. So in order to assess the safety of their products, manufacturers should be able to show that in different cell and animal models that their products are safe in comparison to a standardized nanoparticle with clearly defined toxic effects. And to assess the long-term safety of products once it's out on the marketplace, we could ask manufacturers to conduct longitudinal studies that follow consumers anywhere from between 5 to 10 years just to ensure that the products are going to be safe. And finally, it will be very important that the international organization is constantly reviewing and updating regulations as technology advances. So there's always been a lag between technological advances and the regulations that are implemented. So to address this issue, we could ask researchers to submit a research application. So this would kind of be similar to ethics proposals that researchers have to submit. So the research application in this scenario would have to outline the proposed experiments, potential risks and outcomes that are associated with their research before they start their project. And these applications would be submitted to a university board, and these university boards would then submit further information to the international organization. So if the board deems the research to be dangerous to human and environmental health, they can ask researchers to change their project a little or even terminate it in more extreme cases. So I do realize that this can hinder some of the freedoms that researchers have when it comes to their work, but I feel that in order to minimize the risks of adverse effects to humans and to the environment, it would be important to implement this. And by having this research application, the international organization can monitor any ongoing research, and they can also predict upcoming trends that will have to be addressed, and they can start their review of regulations before this research is even put on the marketplace. So just to conclude, I've shown today that nanotechnology poses a high risk of adverse health and environmental effects, and as a result, it's very prudent to implement conservative policies. If we implement things according to the regulatory framework that I proposed, we would also be making significant investments into basic and applied research, which could then foster innovation and bring about some economic prosperity. But overall, whatever regulations are implemented in the future, I think it's ideal to balance all of the potential risks with the potential benefits of nanotechnology.
The reality here, I think, is that just like mass poisoning in the US led to the formation of the FDA in, I think, the 1930s, some major adverse event will obviously change things here, because there's not regulation of nanotech now, and it would obviously be kind of a burden to suddenly impose it. It would have financial implications. But it will obviously happen when there's some major adverse event, and that hasn't happened yet. So I think what you've presented is sort of only theoretical now, but as soon as something really bad happens, then people will go back to your presentation and say, okay, we better do this now, you know? So it's kind of an interesting point in time where we're sort of in between. I think people have been realizing for a long time that maybe regulation of nanotech is a good idea, but there's actually no practical moves toward that at the moment.
I must confess I have never thought of this, and so I find it very interesting. Has anyone done any studies on the carbon that comes out of nanotech research? Like, do we have a research program to identify carbon imprint from this kind of research? Do you know?
Well, I've read a few studies on PubMed that have shown carbon nanotubes can induce liver toxicity, but it's only been done mostly in like cell lines and in animal models. I don't think there's really a big program. Well, I'm not aware of any programs that exist that focus exclusively on assessing the toxicity of carbon nanotubes, but I think it would be a good idea to start one in the future.
There's something quite relevant to your past life, Earl, which is, of course, that stained glass windows, that's all nanotech. So you can get the idea that this is all something very modern, but in fact we've had these nanotech effects, and they've been heavily used for hundreds of years. So if you're going to start regulating it all, it would be massive. Every, practically all sunscreens now, suntan lotion, they all have it. A lot, clothing has it. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. Yeah.
A quick question. Do you think like nanotechnology will be regulated in a sense like medicine with time? Like for example, doctors have regulations on themselves and stuff like that. Do you think engineers will, or?
Well, presently I don't think nanotechnology is really regulated in medicine right now, but I guess with the research ethics boards that do exist, they do look at some of the potential risks and benefits of using nanotechnology in medicine before they approve the project to begin. So in a sense, I guess it is regulated a little bit, but I don't think there is really much in terms of
See,
regulations.
it goes beyond the question of regulation to the moral standard for people to enter the field. Right now, if you want to become a nanotech person, there's nobody assessing your moral fiber, whether you're good enough, whether you're moral enough. They're just concerned about, whether you're able to do the work kind of thing. Whereas with physicians, there's a whole attempt to make sure that you're a good person and, have the proper aims toward society and that sort of thing. So it would be a huge jump if suddenly every scientist, is also, subjected to that. I had a very good friend in college who got much better grades than I did, but nobody would write him a letter of recommendation for medical school. He's just too much of a, cutthroat kind of guy. But he ended up in science. I don't know that he's doing nanotech now. So yeah, there are many other considerations, and medicine progresses more slowly than other parts of science because it's so heavily regulated. So if you apply that same degree of oversight to all areas of science, it would really slow things down in a way that's probably not desirable. So we have to pick and choose which areas, do we have to pick truly moral people who are trying to help society as opposed to people who can just do science and, just want a job doing science. But I think that if you read the Michael Crichton novel Prey, and stuff, I don't know how quickly we're going to reach the point where some nanotech, event could change human history in a really major way. But we are potentially at least close to that. Yes.
This is more of a theoretical question, but do you think it's even possible to really regulate it? Because even in medicine, sure, we have ethics here, but in other parts of the world, they can do what they want. So, and I think the implications of nanotech are quite large. So, can we really regulate it? Is kind of, what are your thoughts on that? I know you, yeah.
Well, I think it's definitely going to be very difficult to regulate, but I feel that since it has so many widespread applications, the government does really have a large interest in trying to regulate as much of it as possible. But I think there could always be the potential for someone to set up a nanotech lab in his basement or in his garage and just kind of do his own thing secretly. But I think it can be managed, but it's going to be very difficult to regulate. Yeah.
Do you think that the immense diversity of what nanoparticles can be is a kind of practical limit here? Like with explosives, when you go through that line at the airport, part of what they're looking for is not explosive powders themselves, but all manufacturers of explosives have agreed to put these, tracer substances in the mix, and that's what they're actually looking for often. It's a kind of marker for the presence of, explosives. But with nanotech, it's so much more varied what the thing can be. You couldn't ever have that sort of simple, 100 compounds that you're screening for. It just wouldn't be possible. So it's true that governments may have incentive to regulate this, but it's a lot harder to detect who's carrying nanoparticles and who isn't. There's not an easy detector system where you can just scan somebody and say, okay, you're clean. Because, well, it just is, I think it seems practically impossible to determine that a person is free of all conceivable nanoparticles. So you might have to study them for years to be sure of that, right? So in that sense, the enforcement even of the policies that you had would be much harder than enforcement of other policies right now.
That's definitely going to be a problem, I think, enforcement, just because we don't really have the means to even detect nanoparticles in products right now. So it's really just hoping that companies out there will voluntarily let governments know that they have nanoparticles. Right. But again, it's really easy for companies to just evade that, and we could still have potential health and environmental hazards.
So nanoparticles also, their toxicity varies a lot with the concentration of the particle. So you can have things, that can be seen with the naked eye that are very, very concentrated, like paints, and then you can have a very, very, dilute solution of the same thing. They have entirely different properties. It's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing, but very, very dilute solution can be toxic in a way that a very concentrated solution might not be. So it's even more complicated than just thinking of how many different kinds of particles there can be. Okay, well, thank you very much. Yeah.